Jamie from Jamie Loves Martial Arts will be joining. So I sent the link, all should be ready, but I always start first just in case so that I can check if everything works. And hopefully we get people in the comment sections or section, just one. Well, technically there's two comment sections, right? There's the live stream version, then you have proper comments later on in the video. So technically, yeah, but currently that we get a few people engaging in the live stream during the thing. But of course, it will all be published as videos later on. And as I usually do, I haven't done that with Sergio's live stream and a few other things. I still have clips that I really want to edit into concise videos from picking from the topics that we talked about. So that's coming sometime, I guess. And last stream that I did with Sergio, I mentioned that there's a technique that we filmed, sort of breakdown / tutorial thing. I have to edit that too. And then we might have an announcement. Hey, we got Alan, let's go. All right, and soon, maybe I'll drop the announcement during this stream or some other time, but we'll see. So let's wait for Jamie. Alan, have you changed your mind on Misner? All right, Jamie's coming. All right. Let's see, he should be hopping on. Yo,
or afternoon for you.
Good afternoon.
Are you able to hear me?
I can hear you.
Great.
Awesome. My audio is fine. Is it working?
Yeah, I can hear you as well.
Awesome. Perfect. Well, before we start, thank you for doing this. Thank you for joining the live and doing a quick interview / whatever it might be.
Yeah, no problem. Happy to be here.
Awesome. So we can start. Maybe you can just quickly tell a bit about you and your channel to the viewers. We have 2 people right now, and then we can just chat about martial arts. No real structure, really. But I think we share a lot of similar ideas, and then we enjoy similar martial arts stuff. So I think it will be fun for the viewers. So.
Sure. Yeah. So I've been doing martial arts a long time, so it's sort of hard to like explain concisely. But I started out doing like commercially oriented martial arts schools and stuff, so like I did like karate for a little while when I was really young. It wasn't even like a real like style, like they called it like Bushido karate, like it's not like it's not like an actual like karate lineage. And then after that I did Japanese jiu-jitsu with somebody who's fairly they're pretty serious about their lineage. They train under, I think, Fumio Manaka. And then I was still really young then. And then when I was about like 10 or 11, I started doing Taekwondo like very seriously. Like I would train like 4 to 6 times a week, and my stepdad and his aunt were both black belts in quite a few styles. So I would train with them on top of the Taekwondo training, and I would compete pretty regularly. And then when I got my black belt in Taekwondo, after about 3 years or so, I switched to doing MMA. So I just trained in MMA. And then around that time, when I was when I was like 13, I started getting interested in internal martial arts and Taoism. So I was looking to study Tai Chi and Baguazhang and Xingyi, but it was very hard for me to get access to it, especially being that age. Like I couldn't go drive myself to the class. So I kind of was looking around for a teacher until I was about 17 or 18, and then I actually found somebody who was a good teacher in that stuff. And I trained with them for about 6 or 7 years. And then around during that time that I was doing the Tai Chi and the Baguazhang mainly. I did a little bit of Xingyi, but not very much. We had to pick between Xingyi and Bagua. You weren't really allowed to study both.
Yeah.
So I just did Bagua. Um, I started training Tamiki Aikido during that time. Um, and I was very I worked with somebody who was like a multiple time national champion,
Wow.
and you know, we just kind of met through work and started training together, and I sort of have just been studying under him until now. I mean, I still train with him. Um, and then at some point during that time span, I uh, I started doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Really, like I kind of fell into it. Like I got a job working at a martial arts school, and they allowed me to stay on the clock during the jujitsu class and take the jujitsu class. So it was kind of like a no brainer. Like it's getting paid like $11 an hour to do Brazilian jiu-jitsu. I was like, why wouldn't I do this?
Right.
Um, the rule set, because of, you know, it's very open, and it felt like I could really practice things that that I was doing in other martial arts in the jujitsu. And you know, I did a lot of other stuff during that time. You know, before Lavelle moved to Inner Mongolia, I was training with him in New York City. And then he kind of introduced me to Vlad, and so I did some sambo with Vlad Kulikov. So there were quite a few people that I trained with intermittently during that time. You know, I wasn't able to be like full-time students, but I was, you know, pretty active. You know, I would train once or twice a week with them, and I got a lot out of that cross training too. So it introduced me to a really wide variety of things. And then, you know, over the last 6 years or so, I had the opportunity to study some other things. Like you know, I did judo on and off. And also I was able to train Kyokushin for a few months pretty seriously. Like I was doing like 3 or 4 times a week with doing Kyokushin. I really enjoyed that. Um, but yeah, I also did capoeira for quite some time. Yeah, different schools, different teachers, on and off. But yeah, I was able to do quite a bit. So I was able to kind of amass a lot of experience, and from the time from about 4 or 5 years ago, I've been doing martial arts pretty much full time. So you know, I have all day every day to do that.
So
So
cool.
it's helpful for training. You know, people are like, how'd you study so many things and get actually proficient? Like, well, I'm doing it all the time. It's like, you know. But yeah, that's just some of the stuff I've studied, some of my background.
Awesome. So that is indeed Jamie loves martial arts. That's
Yeah.
a lot. Yeah, and that's the thing. That's the first thing that drew me to your channel, and today there's two sort of specific, not really topics, but sort of
Yeah.
directions I'd like to discuss. But really, what like drew me to your channel? Well, a lot of our members from the team, our school, and the channel know you by the close guard heel hook technique video.
Yeah.
It's awesome. That's one of the best.
I
um,
do enjoy getting silly sometimes and doing some.
that was great. That was sort of the video that I would like show people, and then they would go, "Oh, he does this, and there's tutorials on this, stuff like that." So definitely that was that's a great video to like check this out, and then we go into detail. What personally drew me was the Aikido stuff,
Yeah.
because so a little bit. I don't want to like since this is like a stream, I'm not gonna go into detail about like my backgrounds and stuff, but I'm especially on this channel, I show a lot of different Aikido concepts, Aikijitsu, whatever it
Yeah.
might be. In Kung Fu, it's Chin Na, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But me not really having an Aikido background, it's just something that I picked up during all my different trainings in different martial
Yeah.
arts. sort of a thing that I noticed that a lot of people don't do. But I guess I'm key to be exposed to some people that do it who are legit. So very early on, I learned about like kotegaeshi, mabashi, a lot of these different techniques, and I just started incorporating them naturally into like MMA. And now for 3 years or so, I'm doing Japanese jiu-jitsu and MMA. But also we have an Aikido black belt at the school, so I did get exposed to proper like legit Aikido / like Aikijitsu or whatever. But what drew me in was I think I would see like kotegaeshi performed and techniques like those in like some certain like competitions or whatever, but I wouldn't find a lot of tutorials or breakdowns of the technique. Like I would find Aikido breakdowns, but not really the combative side. And I think it was you and Tritech Martial Arts, those guys. I think you were the first like tutorial based guys that actually would show how this works, what's the benefits, and then you would show it in rolling. So that's what drew me in, because I genuinely love those techniques too. So I can let you talk about like a bit about that, like what made you
absolutely.
Tomiki, or did it come from Japanese jiu-jitsu, as you said? When did you start developing those techniques?
Well, I guess so I learned the techniques first in Tomiki Aikido. That's really where the base comes from, and it's quite a complicated topic in a sense. I guess the first thing, the place I would start with it is just saying, so what differentiates these techniques that we're talking about? Because obviously, like even intuitively, there's a connection between these techniques, Japanese jiu-jitsu, Aiki jiu-jitsu, Chin Na, even maybe some of the stuff you see in Filipino martial arts. It's like what makes these locks different than, say, the locks we see in Brazilian jiu-jitsu. And I think if you look at the older judo, you might see a little bit of overlap, but even the judo seems to lean just intuitively to seem a little bit more like Brazilian jiu-jitsu. And the way that I feel like the way that I try to understand it is about type of control are we exerting over the opponent's body. And in Brazilian jiu-jitsu, when you perform a joint lock, we usually are looking for absolute control, meaning that I'm pinning you between my body and the floor so that you can't move at all in space, and then performing the joint lock from that position. There are exceptions to that, like the back, right? Like when you take someone's back, you're not pinning them between yourself and the floor. You're just attached to their back. But even in that case, the control is very stable, right? So the person.
True. Oops. Think we're breaking down a bit. Oh, commenters, people in chat, can you hear Jamie? Is he frozen, or is it from my part? Oh, are we back?
Yeah, I lost you for a second. Yeah. So what I was saying is that the control in Tomiki Aikido, or in any form of Aikido, these types of joint locks is dynamic.
Yeah.
So it's not a static absolute control. It's created by a momentary relative.
Perfect.
I think talking about when we talk about these moves, we're talking about balance. And I think that's key to understanding how to make them work.
I absolutely agree. That's perfect. Because sure.
No, keep going.
I was just gonna add, like a few interviews ago, I talked to Nick from One Man Stampede, also a great channel, but we talked about wrist lock specifically. And even though even if I show them all the time and I use them often, they're still not something like a double leg or like a jab 1-2. All techniques have their own levels of use, and something being like lower percentage or whatever doesn't mean that it's not useful. Like a lot
Yeah.
of people think that they're, if you can't do it against like a pro MMA guy, this and that, but nobody talks about, are you a pro level person?
Yeah,
Because
I mean, I performed Kotagaish, for example, on people of the highest level in jujitsu, like high level jujitsu competitors. Um, it can be very, very effective. So part of the way that I look at that is that and foot sweeping techniques are known to be very not particularly effective, but very low risk.
yes,
Right? Like they don't work all the time, but your investment in connecting to the opponent is low, so your exposure is low. Which, if you look at their effectiveness overall, it actually makes them relatively effective because we don't have to get too close to the opponent and expose ourselves, but we can still take them down. So I tend to look at these types of techniques like Kotagaish as like just being a step further in that direction. As it's even less risk to you to try to perform it, but it may be slightly less effective. But we want to use techniques like this to open up the opponent anyways. Before we start going for bigger things, we want to start manipulating their, the out in grappling is attack the periphery of the person's body, attack their limbs, right, in order to gain access to their center of body mass. So if as soon as possible we can make an attack onto the limb, then we're going to have better ability to get towards the center of body mass.
yeah,
So I think it fits in with the methodology a lot more than people realize. I think one reason that folks have shied away from them is like Ashiwaza and Judo, they require a lot of skill. So you have to really invest in developing the skill to perform them. Um, and people only have so much time, so they tend to want to invest in things like single legs and double legs. So that's one aspect, and then there's also a safety component in that. You know, I put people in Kotagaish, and they decided not to take the fall, and their wrist has definitely, definitely felt it, definitely taken a few pops. I mean, it's nothing catastrophic because I'm not trying to break their arm, but it's certainly something that if you're not familiar with and somebody puts it on you hard and fast, you could definitely take an injury. So there's a little bit of a gray area in terms of like how that fits into the culture of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, where the goal is submissions leading to submission.
yeah,
So because the control is dynamic, it doesn't fit into the paradigm so smoothly. It fits into the rules legally, but it goes against the sort of spirit of the art in some ways.
yeah. Well, well, we got a bunch of comments. I'm just reading the last comment. Is gold.
Yeah, it's funny.
We'll go through the comments a bit later on, but I do want to add about specifically Koregayashi, and I think that it like that technique fits into that area of techniques that, like you said, if you're going to do it sort of philosophically as a BJJ thing, you would want to gradually apply pressure. But even to develop the safer version of Koregayashi, you have to have supreme control. You have to have strong grip to keep it there
Yeah,
if you do it gradually. But imagine, like I do it a lot of times in sparring, when I fight the person, and if they start respecting my like control with the punches, and I come in and I push them like against the wall, cage, or whatever, and when
yeah,
as soon as they try to engage in a clinch, like grab me here or whatever, you
yeah,
can snap after the punch so easily, and it
yeah,
goes so fast. And that's the thing where it's low risk for me. Like the worst thing that
yep.
happened, he just crumbles a bit. Maybe I even get a guillotine or something. But even if he just
Totally.
pops,
You break their posture, take their back.
And
Yeah.
imagine in the perfect situation, I crank the wrist, they fall. Now I got a beautiful takedown with
Yep.
the least amount of energy spent.
Yeah.
Like I could have
Yeah.
pushed for a double leg and then we're scrambling against the cage. Then I go for a single. Then I put it back to the double, whatever, and then I take him down. And now I'm spent. But
Yep.
just do this properly. In the best case scenario, can result
Yep.
in a takedown, and you got top control now, but you haven't
Yes.
spent much energy. Of course, that's
Extremely low energy. Yeah.
yes,
Very efficient.
it's so good. But of course, just the nature of the technique, just all the things have to align. It takes a lot of
Yeah.
skill, and even with the high skill, it's not gonna open itself so easily. So
Yeah. Well, I think that's also it's just a general misconception from, like, if you're outside the door of training martial arts versus, sort of being inside the door, people don't understand multiplicity in fighting. I don't beat anyone with one move. I don't have some I'm not one punch man. I don't have some really powerful single move that destroys everyone. That's not how it works. Each move is only as good as the system of dilemmas that you create around it. So, when you set things up and threaten various things, you put your opponent in a tactical dilemma where they have to make a choice between two bad options. That's
yeah,
where it starts to really be effective. And that often means that you can't dictate what technique you're going to use. Am I going to do Kotagaishi, or are they going to turn around to get out of Kotagaishi, and then I'm just going to jump on their back, or put them in a rear body lock. So you have to understand the relationships between the techniques, and in order to get to be effective, you have to utilize techniques as parts of dilemmas. Kind of chaining different things together is absolutely critical. And I think people just don't understand that. It's not part of, like, what you learn. You think that people just, when you don't do martial arts, people think that, oh, they just have this sort of like invincible technique. They're going to hit me with the iron palm and I'm going to drop. It's kind of like that kind of thinking. So a
yeah.
lot of times people are like, oh, well, what about this move or that move? It's like, it's not any one move.
Exactly. I was just about to bring that up. Like often when I would tell like sort of people who train more like just MMA or some combat sport, and then I like tell them about the Karagashi because whatever we're training and doing this, and a lot of people when they don't know about the technique or they just hear, oh, that's Aikido, that sucks. Whenever they approach with that mindset, a lot of times if I try to explain why it works and how it works, then it's always, well, I would just do this. But then I point them out, but that's the exact same thing that an untrained person who thinks they're tough would tell you for any technique. Like throw a
Yeah.
jab, yeah, I do this. Okay, then I
Or
throw.
or a perfect example is, like, people get my leg on a single leg, and about 99% of the time I throw them Uchimata.
Yeah, there,
It's like,
perfect.
so just single legs now not work? Single legs are a great technique. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with single legs. It's just all techniques have counters.
Yeah.
There's always a counter to a technique. It's just that's how it works. It's not.
People sort
It's
of
people have a very weird
yeah,
misconception of that. Oh, I'll just do this. Well, yeah, there's always a way to defend something.
always the best technique of all time that you can like try and imagine will have a counter because I think people think of it like
There's no
untrained.
perfect technique.
Yeah, there that doesn't exist, and I think it's like people think like it's in video games, like in Tekken. Whenever you punch
Yeah, yeah,
somebody,
yeah.
then you got like the animation, so you can't respond. There's no like real
Yes.
interaction. It's like okay,
Yeah,
you
totally.
do 3-4-5, then he does 3-4-5. That's not
Yeah.
how fighting works. That's
Yeah.
so the movies do it too. So probably a lot of people who
Yep.
don't train martial arts, that's their only relation to how.
Reference point. Yeah, yeah. Totally.
Oh yeah, the worst are the street fighters. I just see red, bro. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
that should be the martial arts system on its own. The see red bro, though.
Yeah, I guess in a way, I sort of have two minds about that because on the one hand, I think that it's there's such value in technique and being trained, but also I also think that you know martial arts are for lack of a better term, they're like an endowment in the sense that it is something that is discoverable for each person within their own body. We don't like all martial arts were invented by humans,
Yes.
who were experimenting with their mind and their body and training in various ways, right? So there's really nothing preventing a smart, capable person from coming up with something that's very effective, or even just in the spur of the moment using their body in a way that's dangerous. It comes down to a number of factors. Like, I'll give you an example. Like, I was watching, sometimes I'll study like closed circuit television video of like just things that happen where people get like stabbed or attacked or something. And there was one where this taxi driver is getting stabbed by a woman, and he does everything right. He gets two hands on the knife hand. He pins her hand somewhere, and this woman just she has the knife and her hand is pinned, and she just drops it into her other hand and stabs the shit out of him and kills him.
There you
And
go.
like, she had no training. She didn't do martial arts. Like, she's just vicious. And
Oh,
sometimes when you just have somebody who's has that mindset, they can be very dangerous. So it's like, yeah, I spend a lot of time training, and I have various, action capacities. I'm conditioned, all these different things. I have skills. Sure, I get somebody who's untrained, I'm probably going to beat them. But one thing that think helps me in those encounters is that I respect the inherent power of the human body. I'm
yeah.
like, this person is dangerous. I don't care if you don't know anything. To me, you're still dangerous, and I want to neutralize that danger in the best possible way by understanding, how do you generate force. Are your feet connected to the ground? Because if your feet are connected to the ground, then you can hurt me. So
Yes.
I want to respect the danger of a person. So I always have sort of two minds about it. I'm like, yeah, like, you're an idiot, you see red. But also, I wouldn't underestimate anyone just because I think that that's a tactical disadvantage in and of itself.
Exactly. This is like you couldn't have said it better, because I was thinking about all of this fairly recently, and this is just like perfect segue, because like a lot of people in like science type communities and then the conversations, people talk like, is math, like mathematics, invented or created? And we
Yeah,
can think the same thing about martial arts. Are they are they discovered, or are
yeah,
they created in that sense? Because as you said, it's one human body. It's just principles of body mechanics, and technically it's discovered. But then you can talk about like methods of achieving this and that, which is like created or invented or whatever. But human body is human body. Like, no matter how intuitions for fighting aren't the best, especially somebody with a crazy mindset, maybe somebody just wild, can be a bigger danger than a composed like martial artist, because you never
totally.
know. And it's like you said, it's inherent, it's in the laws of physics that govern the body mechanics, which are fighting techniques. That's all that it is, and
Yeah.
it's everybody. So
And system capture is really dangerous for martial artists in that we all train in a certain way, and we get accustomed to training in that way. And if you get like tunnel vision into that paradigm, like, there's a functionality to the way that certain arts are trained, like Brazilian jiu-jitsu, for example. Like, we want to move in a controlled and execute technical maneuvers. Why? Because the technical maneuvers and your skill in applying those technical maneuvers are what allows you to beat an untrained opponent, right?
yes,
But at the same token, an untrained opponent isn't performing technical maneuvers. They perform like what we describe as like being wild or spazzy, right? And what's the issue there is that a wild and spazzy person, they're dangerous in an unpredictable way, right?
Yes.
So I can use my skill that I've developed, right, to defeat somebody who's wild and unpredictable. However, there's a possibility that I'm going to be injured in the course of doing that. I'm going to win the fight, but maybe I get caught with a random elbow, right? And this happens all the time in training. So it's very important to understand the system capture issue of we're all training a particular way for a reason. There's a methodology there. The methodology isn't necessarily wrong, but we have to be very careful about just thinking that that methodology is the thing, right? All models are inaccurate to some degree. That's the usefulness of the model. So we're working on applying a model to fighting, right? But we have to understand that fighting itself is more chaotic and unpredictable than any model can represent. That's the usefulness of the model, right? It's the usefulness of the training methodology. So you have to be really, really, really cautious that you don't start to think, oh, this method of practicing an art, whether it's jujitsu or MMA or Tamiki Aikido, right? This combat sport, that it is fighting, because it isn't. It's a methodology to practice getting better at fighting with some longevity. And I think this gets into some of the issues with traditional martial arts, because traditional martial arts have to be practiced in a decoupled way, because they were battlefield killing arts, right? Like we can't do naginata jutsu and just kill each other, right?
Exactly.
They couldn't do that. It wouldn't work. There'd be no soldiers left. So they had to come up with decoupled ways to practice fighting. And this led to the degradation of the art as the battlefield component went away.
Exactly, because you don't have that like testing field, sort of. But that's perfect.
Exactly. The actual thing is gone, right? What are we training for? Oh, that thing you're actually training for doesn't exist anymore. So now you have this basically this like copy, and we've all played the telephone game as kids, right? I say a word and the next person says a word, the next person says a word, and you watch it transform down the line without the testing ground to go back and forth between. You're gonna lose the essence of what it is. I mean, at this point, I don't even think you can really develop martially without the actual thing. It needs to be coupled, right? Like you need what you're practicing to be directly coupled. So like it gets a little bit into like sort of what they call ecological dynamics, and constraints-based training is we need to directly perceive whatever it is, the affordance in the environment that allows us to act. So my Kotagaishi effective is that I have experience seeing the body positions of my opponents that make them susceptible to Kotagaishi.
Perfect.
Everybody who does Aikido or Japanese Jiu-Jitsu can perform a Kotagaishi against an unresisting opponent. The issue is when the person is resisting, their training, for the most part, with the exception really of Tamiki Aikido, is mostly decoupled. They're mostly practicing on somebody who's cooperating. So the issue becomes that because they have no experience perceiving the opportunity to perform the move, they're not able to perform the move when it actually comes down to a resisting opponent.
You said, and that's the thing, like when you bring up Tomiki Aikido, which has a sporting system in place, that shows, even like you said earlier, it's all modeled. And if we were to like just imagine the best model that we possibly can, it's not going to be sustainable. It's just not possible, because like you can then you have to think like in the sense of what's physically possible to do in a lifetime. Then you'd have to quantize everything, then you have to segment it, but then that's ruining the perfect imaginatory system. So that's why BJJ guys are going to be the best at a certain element of fighting, because that's what they do most of the time. But they're always going to be better than somebody that quantizes. But then you can think, okay, but they will be better at all these different things. there's like a funny line. I suck at everything the same, so I'm good at MMA. Like I'm good at at it all.
Yeah, totally. Well, I
Yeah,
think that
possible.
so to be effective in fighting, the idea is something I talk about is funneling. So
Okay.
we want to take the fight to the area where we have the most expertise and we have the greatest advantage. So we're trying to funnel the breadth of things that can happen in fighting into a specific area where we can be very effective. And it's a lot faster to develop. You develop one area, like let's say you're really good at chokes, rear naked chokes from the back, right? You then look for ways in all scenarios of fighting to funnel it to that position. And then you don't have to be good at everything. You just have to be good at getting to the thing you're good at from everywhere. And that really pares down the number of skills that you have to learn. And that's just in terms of if your goal is to be effective. There's lots of different reasons and goals that people have in practicing martial arts and also in fighting. So it might not be your goal to be the most effective, but if that is your goal, then I think the pathway to that is learning how to funnel the opponent into a particular set of situations that you are very experienced with.
Exactly. You're trying to develop skill that best facilitates your area of expertise. And that's what's really important. When I catch a kotegaeshi in rolling, it's not because my kotegaeshi on its own is like 100%, it's like maxed out. If we were to imagine
Yeah.
stats, it doesn't
Yeah.
have to be maxed out. It's just that I'm facilitating it through proper skill so that it can happen. So facilitating element is what's important. And
So
then we
see,
can
I would actually argue that means your kotegaeshi is maxed out. That is maxing out your kotegaeshi. That people are really the whole idea of technical perfection is imaginary because otherwise techniques in application would always be the same, but they're not. We see variance. You always see a variant. Every kotegaeshi I've ever done has been slightly different. Oh, there's this one, there's that one. I turn my body like this. None of them were exactly the same. The dimensions and positions of my opponents were never the same. So you have to see that and say, what is really the skill? The skill is the coupled ability with the perception of the affordance for kotegaeshi and then executing kotegaeshi. So that's really the skill. The skill is seeing. It's like drawing, right? People think there's something special about the person's hand. It has nothing to do with your hand. It's really in your eye and your mind, your ability to take a three-dimensional image and then flatten it into 2D. It's the same thing with martial arts. What are we really training? We're training the mind to perceive the opportunity to perform these techniques.
Like this is the best example I could have possibly have gotten because I'm a visual artist, so I draw, and I actually use that analogy in a similar way often. So that's perfect. You couldn't have said it better. And that's the whole thing. Like as you said, if you're decoupled and you're just showing the kotegaeshi without the context, then no matter how good it is mechanically, that's a lower like stat technique. Like there isn't that, and that's the whole like the thing that we mentioned earlier. The perfect sort of conceptual system doesn't exist because it's not how reality works at all.
Totally.
So that's super fascinating, and that's like a perfect analogy. As
I would say it's almost a different skill, right? Like if you have a mechanically perfect kotegaeshi, like that means that you're really good at applying kotegaeshi against someone who's not resisting.
Exactly.
Right? Exactly. And then there's a totally different skill of applying this against a resisting opponent. And that I think that sort of gets into the debate between Tamiki Aikido and other styles of Aikido. We get a lot of flack from the other groups of Aikido for having the sport element. And I think that it's just a fundamental, I think it's a misinterpretation of the times And there's a party line that comes down from the Aikikai about what O-sensei wanted and stuff, and I don't know how accurate that is, because even when I go back and I read stuff, even stuff that comes from them, there's a lot of instances of O-sensei working with sumo wrestlers, of him working with baseball players. He didn't say to them, "Oh, stop doing sumo, stop playing baseball." That's not Aikido. He said Aikido is a universal concept that you can apply to these other things that you're doing, regardless of whether or not it's a sport. And
Right.
if you look into Jigoro Kano and what he was thinking, and Tamiki obviously trained with both of them, you know, Kano was looking to preserve the spirit of the Japanese martial arts. And he realized, I think very intelligently, that this could only be done through creating a combat sport that people could train and develop these coupled skills, right? He realized it needed to be coupled with live resistance, and that what was happening throughout this Meiji Restoration era is that as people stopped being able to fight and kill each other, that the skills would decline because there was no longer this legitimate testing ground for them. And it's also interesting because if you look at the history of O-sensei and then his teacher Takeda, right? Both of these guys, they got into a lot of fights.
Yes.
Takeda was just like killing people all over the place. And it's very interesting that now you get these lineages and they're like, no, like don't compete, don't do any sparring. And it's like, well, how do you think, do you want to just emulate the dead skills of these people, or do you want to actually emulate the conditions that gave rise to the skill that made them famous?
And here's a perfect example, if I can interject.
Of course.
Look at Max Holloway.
Yeah.
Like for years now, he's been saying, I don't spar anymore. I don't spar. I don't do this. From his perspective, that's totally fine because he's clogged in insane amount of hours sparring. And when you look at like O-sensei, he's fought, he's done the work, and it's just a natural progression that he took. So it's like, are you copying where he is during that period, or are you trying to emulate the journey? Because if I want to be good like Max Holloway, I'm not going to stop sparring. That's copy.
I think it's also a matter of definitions there too. So, like, I for a while I was training with Glover Teixeira and his fight team. When I lived in Danbury, I would train with them, and we used to do a lot of really, really hard sparring, like give you concussions, make you piss blood, that type of stuff. And
wow,
what I realized sort of towards the end of it is like, I gained a lot from it. I'm also lucky because, I was pretty skilled, so I was able to not rack up too many injuries. I had a friend who got knocked out like 3 times while we were training there. I was like, maybe you should just stop coming. Like, but there are ways, and I'm realizing this in jiu-jitsu too, there are ways, and they may even be more effective than free sparring, to practice these skills in a coupled manner, right? Like, you can still have the direct perception of the affordances in the environment that are giving you the ability to execute the movements that are effective, right? You can still find effective movement solutions. You can probably find effective movement solutions better in a more constrained situation. So, like, let's say you want to get good at, kotagaishi, right? Start with the grip. Do rounds where you're starting with that grip. You see what I'm saying? And then you're gonna get 1,000 more looks at kotagaishi than you would if you just did free sparring. And if you make your opponent aware that you're looking for kotagaishi, they're able to give you much more cognizant resistance, and that increases your skill development too. Now you're not just getting good at doing kotagaishi against somebody who's not expecting it, you're getting good at doing it on the person who is expecting it, which adds
Exactly.
another layer of development. So when you add these constraints in, so Max Holloway says he doesn't spar. I guarantee you he's doing a lot of live drilling, and it's
Yes.
safer, it's more constrained, and it's providing him a richer environment to learn than that free sparring would.
Yes, because and that's the whole like conceptual thing that we mentioned again. It's always there because free sparring, you're literally trying to imitate a real fight, and
Yes.
we can play a game and like, count all the techniques that happened in this session. Then you spar again, you're gonna count all kinds of different techniques, and then you think about that. Where's that funneling, like you said? Where's that like specific concept that you're trying to develop? Then you have to
Yes.
quantize. Then you have to
Yes.
remove other things, and like you said, start from the grip. Then it's gonna be far richer, as you said. Then it's just gonna open up like situational sparring and getting out of position.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's so
So I
important.
think situational sparring is kind of like the first step towards really doing like this constraints-based training, constraints-based approach where you're actually focusing both players on the specific tasks that they need to complete in order to develop the skill that you're looking to develop. And it's interesting because it's very weird in the sense that you would assume without thinking about it that free sparring would be the most representative of fighting, but you actually through these constraints can create situations that are more representative than free sparring. So we actually get a better representation of the end goal and better skill development. And you also eliminate a lot of the risks. Like you eliminate some of the danger and unpredictability of movement by focusing both people on specific tasks.
Yes, and can you imagine if your only system of getting better was sparring? Just just sparring. Like you're gonna be horrible because you're even gonna learn bad habits, and then you're gonna have to unlearn them from it.
Yeah.
So it's so important to
Well, that's the
properly.
thing is it's system capture in the sense of if you're just sparring, it's also a matter of who you're sparring with, right? Like let's say you're just sparring and the person's untrained. You're going to drop to that level in terms of you're only going to learn to do things that allow you to beat that person and survive those sparring matches. It's not actually going to give you the ability to rise to fight somebody who's better. So if instead you take that person and you say, listen, I want you to just throw jabs and I'm just going to work on getting around your jab, right? You could actually develop a lot more that way with the same barely trained person, right? By playing very specific targeted games, you're going to get more skill development than just free sparring, I mean, I think the only thing worse than somebody who just does free sparring is somebody who just does technique and no sparring, right?
Yeah, of course.
So either
Yeah,
thing in isolation doesn't really work very well. What you really want is these targeted games, and I think that exposes this aspect of it being an endowment, right? So when you focus in on these very targeted games, then you start to intuitively and naturally develop effective movement solutions for the situations that you're ending up in. And this is where a good coach and good coaching and thoughtful coaching comes in that these people can look at the sport or fighting in its essence, right, at the highest level and say, okay, these are the situations that these people are getting in. These are the places they're finding themselves in. This is where they're winning or losing. These are the critical elements, right? And then
yeah,
create specific sparring situations, specific live training games that
yes.
really get you to hype to focus in on what is the critical factor in a particular situation that makes the difference, right?
Yes, 100%. Like that's, and even if now you just made me think. I remember, I think John Danaher had a video on like standing wrist locks, and if I recall, I might be wrong, but I don't recall him ever saying something like "it sucks," "it doesn't work," or it's never going to work. From what I remember, he said it's just the same thing about facilitating that technique is
Yes.
where the problem lies. It's not about the technique itself. It's just that that area is underdeveloped in most people, and even people who like main Aikido branch or even like traditional Chin-Na practices that don't have these systems in place or don't spar. That's the problem. So it's that you being the vessel for the technique in mind, and I don't recall him ever saying anything like this shit sucks, like a lot of people want to say for whatever reason.
Yeah, I mean, then that's another thing that I sort of have two minds about, right? Because for a long time, I had this very romanticized idea about Aikido, about all martial arts. And I went to Japan last summer and it really fell apart on me. So like, the way I used to think about it was there was some kernel of truth at the heart of these arts, right? And that like the Japanese, the masters, the Chinese master, that they had something, right? And that thing, whatever they had, was really powerful, and they understood something that I don't understand. And then I got there, and it became obvious to me that what was working for me was not some magical essence of Aikido that I had tapped into. It was actually applying, it was my own methodology of trying to make this stuff work in jiu-jitsu and not being rigid about the way I was doing it. By being flexible and altering techniques as I see fit, using muscle, not using muscle, just not being so anal about all these things, and just trying to figure out how I make this work. By doing that, it turned out that I had developed a higher level of skill and application than many of these people who you would expect to know more about it than me. So I realized that what had really been working for me wasn't actually Aikido. What had really been working for me was my own methodology in playing with these particular positions and movements. So like, it kind of made me change the way I look at it, in the sense that I'm like, yeah, I don't really do Aikido.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not really doing Aikido. I just was inspired by some Aikido techniques to try those positions out, and through live training, through a methodology of applying these things in an environment where there is resistance, I developed some really nice stuff that works even in their own environment. So I took it back to Tamiki Aikido Randori, and it works. It works better than a lot of Tamiki Aikido Randori players can perform. So I was like, oh wow, this is weird. Like, you could get better than them at their own thing by doing it differently, and that really kind of wiped out the way that I had romanticized it, and it made me think, like, when the MMA guy comes in, he's like, Aikido is garbage. It's like, I don't think that Aikido is garbage, but they have a point. They're talking about something.
Exactly. And you know what's the craziest thing about, like, now that you bring that up? Like, on this channel, I've made a couple of videos where I discuss the trouble with defining martial arts. Because as you say now, it's not really Aikido, but it certainly is, but it ain't. And like, how many different martial arts, just people forget that that's like we said earlier, it's all in our bodies, it's all in the biomechanics. Fighting is fighting. We make it what it is. We are the ones that choose the words that define what this is. And then it all starts to break down when you look at the borders. Like, when does judo stop and BJJ begin? Because then you can say judo newaza. But
I
what?
think,
So
I think there's a number of ways to talk about this, and I actually wrote like a short article about this because I was getting into it with people a lot about, is this Aikido? Is this what is it? Blah blah, blah. And this was before I went to Japan, so maybe if I had written it now, it would have been slightly different. But the way I talk about it is, first we talk about lineage, right? So historically, where did you get this technique from? Where did you learn it from, right? So like Kotagaishi exists in Shin-Na, it exists in Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, it exists in Daito Ryu, it exists in Aikido. So where did you learn it from? If you learned it from Aikido, then we can talk about it as being Aikido technique. I think that's reasonable. It's a reasonable way to discuss it, right? And then there's a technical component in terms of what technique is this, and is that technique generally considered to be a part of that art, right? So like you could learn wakigatame in judo, and you could learn wakigatame in sambo, and you could learn wakigatame in aikido. Chances are you're not learning wakigatame in Brazilian jiu-jitsu. So if you see a Brazilian jiu-jitsu person doing wakigatame, then chances are they learned that from somewhere else. So we're probably not going to talk about wakigatame as being Brazilian jiu-jitsu, right? It's probably something else. So we can talk about lineage in terms of who did you learn this from, but we also can talk about what techniques are commonly referred to as being in that. And mind you, all of this stuff, my approach to it is a little bit practical in the sense that I'm not particularly caught up in minutia. I want to just be able to talk to people and communicate in a way that's honest and reflects my experience. And then the third component that we can talk about is, from a philosophical standpoint, what body mechanics, what principles of fighting are being implemented to make this work, right? So like, and then this is where it gets a little bit muddled, is like, for many years, like I would say that I didn't do jujitsu. I was doing Tai Chi and Baguazhang in a jujitsu context because mentally, philosophically, that's where my mindset was at. It was only when I went down to Florida and was training with Wagner that and Cyborg that I like really became a jujitsu person. I was like, no, forget this other stuff. I want to just get good at this, right? I want to just embody jujitsu for a while. So, it really depends. I think that's the loosest sort of category of it, but it still is important because, we can do a technique from jujitsu or a technique from any martial art with the principles and body mechanics of another martial art. And then, you want to be realistic about that. Like there's a particular kotagaishi that I do where I grab the person's wrist and then I just run away from them. Like I'm holding their wrist, I'm running, and then I turn back, right? And that's probably the one kotagaishi that I do that I would say this isn't Aikido, because the source of the power has nothing to do with Aikido. It's just it's an athletic maneuver. It doesn't
perfect.
have anything to do with the principles or mechanics of Aikido.
Perfect example, and I think you'll definitely agree and enjoy this. I even made a video, but here's how I can, with Kotagaishi, from my experience, I can cover all these three things. So first, I learned this motion. First time I was exposed to it was Chin-Na. So already in that first area, it's not from Aikido.
Yeah.
But then, I perform it in Japanese Jiu-Jitsu with a Aikido black belt that showed me some variations on it in a Japanese context. I perform it. Now, suddenly, okay, are we considering Aikido there? But then the third thing is, I made a video where I did two different Aikidos and Kotegaishis on the same same sparring session, but just two different people. One of them was like my opponent had an underhook and I had like an overhook. And I already prepared this hand here, so he cannot defend it. And this hand comes here, and there's no Aiki. It's just me being an asshole and cranking.
Yeah, totally. It's all muscle. There was no like off balance. It was just a lock.
So is it now Chinna? Is it now Aikido? It's the technique, it worked, but it's some other technique that is not closely associated with Aikido can be considered Aikido. Like I would do some like variations on like shooting techniques, but then I would actually use the Aiki motion and I would blend, and then it could be considered Aikido, even though it's not necessarily seen. But the craziest thing about all this, it just becomes semantics. It really
it's totally
doesn't
semantical entirely. But
like
some people are really, really interested in that. Me personally, I'm not particularly interested in it because my own perspective on this is that there are no techniques because the Kotagaishi you learned in Chin-Na, it's not Kotagaishi. It's a specific Chin-Na technique that has its own name, right?
Yeah.
And even that technique, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. If we're talking about fighting, if you want to talk about preservation of martial systems, that's a whole nother interest and a whole nother dimension. But if we're talking about fighting, there's no one technique. It always is variable. It's always changing. It's always going to change according to the situation. So there's no way to say, yeah, these are the same general body position, sure, but it's not one thing, and it exists in relationship to different direct perceptions of different affordances.
You
So
can also
it's
with defining it. Like if I'm interjecting again, if I'm not like cutting you off.
No, continue.
But let's consider a roundhouse kick. That's a name for a technique. I could show you 7 or 8 different roundhouse kicks. Shouldn't they all have their own separate name then? Then we can go further. Okay, so these 7 or 8, but they can be thrown from different positions. So now they're
different setups.
But then it could be
and then I could show you probably 1,000 clips of people knocking people out with roundhouse kicks.
Yes.
And they're all going to be different. The length of their limbs is different. Their power generation is different. The distance was different. The setup was different. The angle of their foot on impact was different. You're not going to find any 2 kicks that are exactly the same. So there is no technique. There's only there's this general method of using your body. There's this general position. That's all there is. There isn't actually a technique. The technique is an illusion. The technique is one specific example in space and time. It's one thing that somebody did once, and we're trying to hold on to it.
Yes. And then we put the label on it. Then it's us who decides what this is. And it's not really like in philosophy, they'd say like ontologically, like what this thing actually is. It's not about that. It's about definition. It's like the usage of this. Like it's us humans that we call this something. And then somebody else calls it this. But nobody has access in that sense with words as to what it actually is, because as you said,
that's behind, like, right? That's like we were always interfacing through something philosophical, like from philosophical standpoint. There's always some gap between what we're able to describe and what the essence of something is. I think that the best way to talk about it is that we can take a something and say, well, what's invariant about this? What never changes, right? So a roundhouse kick, what is that? Well, it's a movement where, there's going to be some rotation and the leg is horizontally oriented, right? Like it's a horizontal orientation of the leg, and it usually comes from the side, right? And that's like there's certain things, right, that are going to really, like, in a loose sense, the chamber position where the leg is horizontal is the only thing that's invariant about a roundhouse kick. You don't have to step. You could step forward. You could step backwards. You could spin around first. There's all these different things you could do, but there's a particular position of the leg where it's horizontally oriented and it's swinging, right? Versus a side kick, which is horizontally oriented, but it's thrusting. So we talk about roundhouse. It's a rotational movement,
Yeah.
and the leg is horizontally oriented. That's really all we can say about
Right.
it. But my thinking is that you will get the person who thinks that way and says, I'm going to experiment with every single way that I can horizontally orient my leg and swing it. And I'm going to look for every situation in combat, and I'm going to just experiment with this, do differential learning, look at all the different ways I can do this, all the different ways. They're going to discover the best roundhouse kicks. They're going to have the most variety of roundhouse kicks, and that's going to give them the adaptability, right? So there's in some of these models, they have two stages of learning a skill. You have coordination, which is just developing the ability to move in that way, right? And then you have adaptation, adapting that skill to different perceptions of affordances. And I actually know a guy who trains striking like this, and like he just has like a big, like one of those round bags in his apartment, and he just will swing on that thing all day, right? Like just, and he'll do weird stuff. He's hopping in, he's hopping out, he's throwing hooks, and he's like the most incredible striker. But it's all taught. It's all just him sitting in that room for hours and hours a day, experimenting with every little piece of minutia that he can come up with. Every way he can move his body, he's experimented with it. And that's given him such a breadth of experience over other fighters. You know, other fighters, they just trained what they were showed and they thought this is the best way. No. He's actually figured out what's the best way. And you know, I've seen this guy break a cinder block, you know, not a patio block. I've seen him just break a cinder block. I'm like, how did you do that? He's like, well, I just put it on the thing and I just whacked at it for months and months and months until I figured out how to break one. You know, so it's like there's an incredible value in intelligent experimentation. That's how this stuff was discovered in the first place. So when you approach it from that standpoint, and you have some mindfulness and some ingenuity, you can really get far. Just to touch back on what you were saying about naming stuff, you know, I think when we're talking to other people in the martial arts community, that 3-part formula just can be useful for communication. To say, I don't want to get into semantics with people. I'd prefer if everybody wanted to just look at it as body mechanics. But if I have to talk to somebody about it, you know, I'll say, this is what I'm calling this because this is where I learned it. It's commonly found in this art. And these are the principles that I felt I was using. And people will argue with you about that. They'll be like, no, that's not Aikido. That wasn't Aiki. That wasn't Tai Chi. That wasn't Jin. That wasn't this. And it's like, okay, sure. You know, this is nebulous. Not for you, but this is what I was trying to do. You know, I'm not lying to you about that.
Exactly. And you know what's the funniest thing? That, like, especially this last year, like a lot of times I would just crack myself up because I would think when people ask me, like, oh, you train like martial arts, what specifically? Like, I often have trouble with saying that because, sure, I just say, okay, I'm training at a Japanese jiu-jitsu school. But really, there we're doing sport jiu-jitsu. So we are doing Newaza and like Brazilian stuff. Then we do like the fighting system. Then we do self-defense, which essentially is just MMA trainings when we do it. But then also I incorporate Wing Chun into it. Then I also incorporate Aikido into it. But then it's all technically just MMA again. Then I fought in MMA in amateur. So am I doing MMA now? And it's like, you know, when you see, like you said, the unspecific karate, you know, like jokes when you have the Mech Dojo that just says martial arts and how that's good. But that's really what I'm doing.
Yeah, totally.
It's like I'm putting a label. Sure, it's useful when you're communicating, but if you're really thinking about it, I'm doing it all and none of it.
Yeah, it's funny because you get me in a conversation like this, and I'm like super loquacious, and I have a lot to say. But like, if you ask like my fiance or somebody about like what I say when people ask me about martial arts, I'm like, yeah, I do jujitsu.
Yeah, there you go.
I just like I don't really want to talk about it unless it's going to be, you know, an intelligent conversation. So I tend to just sort of like try to give them some kind of party line to satisfy them. You know,
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah, I do karate.
Let's just look at that. And that's so funny because, like you said, it's at least if you approach from this sort of angle that we're doing here. Like, if I'm being honest, I've fought in MMA a couple of times, just amateur. I'm probably just always going to stay amateur. But the thing is, I had only 3 like real MMA in the sense of like formal MMA classes. Everything else is training with people who fought and trained in MMA, doing sparring, doing all this. So technically, I was doing MMA in the ring when I fought, but I wasn't doing what you would consider traditionally MMA because I didn't actually like show. But
yeah, and that's the language is very tricky, right? So there's MMA, the rule set of the as a sport, right? So like you fought in an MMA competition, and then there's also what I would call like an emergent martial art of MMA, which is a combination of wrestling, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, boxing, and Muay Thai. So when you mix those 4 arts together, that's what we would call like generic MMA, right? And then people will they can insert other things into that as subcomponents. But if we want to talk about MMA as a martial art, it's very new, but that would be like if you were going to go to MMA class, you would be learning a combination of wrestling, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, boxing, and Muay Thai.
Right.
But there's plenty of people, you know, who fight in MMA rule set who don't have that particular mix of arts. Yeah.
Yeah, my mix, if I was gonna like completely like try and use semantics and then confine it to something, I'd say it's I do Wing Chun and Japanese Jiu-Jitsu in MMA.
Yeah.
But even then, you could go further and say, well, it's not exactly that. So you can go forever with like defining what it is. Because,
yeah, and it's also very tricky because you can do a cold reading of some of the classics from any martial art and then go and experiment and come up with something totally different, you know? Like I have this text on Liu He Ba Fa, like water boxing, and like I read it and I'm like, I go and I apply it to jujitsu all the time, and I'm like, you know, like I don't know any water boxing, you know, like, but this book is great, you know, it's very weird. Like it's like you know, you read any of these things, you could read some of the stuff that O Sensei's written, you could read some of the stuff that Jigoro Kano's written, you could read the Tai Chi classics, you could look at Wing Chun theory, and then go and fight with it, and you'll probably come up with something totally different than, you know, the interpretation of these things is kind of like religion, you know, like you get these holy books and then people's interpretations of them just vary wildly, like just completely insane variations of what's written. But you know, that's they're not that constraining a lot of times, you know, like people think that they're much more constrained because when you've practiced in a school and in a lineage, you know, and not to say it's bad, but for the most part in all martial arts, Brazilian jiu-jitsu included, when you're in a school, a lot of what goes on is just mimicry. So when you're in that lineage of mimicry, you tend to be like really like tunnel vision about the way you're interpreting the particular principles of that art. But you get somebody from outside the paradigm and they read those principles, they just don't have that same interpretation, you know. They're gonna see it very differently.
That's so true. And I love this comment. That would be 50% of our BJJ club. They all do Wing Chun. That sounds like an place.
I was doing some experiments with a Wing Chun guy with combat jiu-jitsu. Like we were working with incorporating. It turns out that the Chi Sao works very well. Like, you know, you have one person in closed guard and the other person on top, and you do Chi Sao from there, and it actually works really. It almost we realized that it almost works better than Chi Sao standing up,
Ex-
because the issue with a lot of Wing Chun when you're standing is that people move around, right? So when you're in closed guard, nobody can move their feet. They're stuck there. So it actually was like it was even better than it
Right.
works when you're standing, and it's such a funny thing because nobody thinks to do that, but we were like doing it. We were like, this is more effective than the Wing Chun is when we're standing. Like there's no single legs, there's no double legs. Like nobody can back up and hit you with a cross. Like it's like we're stuck at this range, and you're trying to hit me, and I can deflect and take your back like 9 times out of 10. It was a very interesting experiment.
It's super fun because like last live stream, I talked to Sergio from Practical Combat, and I told him about this idea, because he also has like a kung fu Wing Chun background,
Yeah.
to a degree. But like I've been talking also to Alan. I think he's watching a great channel in defense of traditional martial art too, and we were discussing Wing Chun and where my understanding of the theory worked the best. Let's keep it standing first, because that's when I discovered that it works on the ground too. But it's like if you look at the makyong, the wooden dummy, it's not like the heavy bag. You can't move all the way around it. It's against the wall. So I would always think, okay, let's see paksa, whatever. Let's try and do this technique or whatever. But it's not going to work the same way that the theory teaches about the tripod, about like structure and getting it from the ground and unmoving elbow and this and that. But then I would just like go crazy, push somebody against the wall. Holy shit, now it all snaps into place. Like I have a sparring footage with an awesome boxer. He's also training at a local gym, and he's awesome. I want to upload the full sparring footage, but I haven't figured out the video yet, so I might do that. He's much better, much bigger, much stronger. He's like an actual contender. He absolutely destroyed me. But when I was doing the best was when I would push against the cage. And if you would to look at my structure, it's literally the forms.
Yeah.
And pushing somebody that they can't go back against,
Yeah.
they literally become the wooden dummy. And now the ground is just a further example of that, because
Yes,
now
it's the same type of constraint because it limits movement.
And it's even better than that against the wall. It's like the ultimate form of that. So
yeah, and that gets into another thing that I often talk about is like, we often don't consider the affordances of the actual environment that we're fighting in, right? So there's only one martial art in existence or combat sport that's performed on an unlimited playing field, right? And that's Mongolian Bok is done. There's no boundary, right? You can go as far as you want. And there's no time limit, right? But everything else is performed in an environment, and I wouldn't be surprised if Wing Chun, given the way it's performed, if it developed in a very constrained environment, if it's ideal for fighting in close quarters. We're fighting in an elevator or a telephone booth or on a rooftop, right? And you can't move very far, right?
Exactly.
Then it becomes much more effective, right? So you have to take into account the environment, and I think that's one thing we miss sometimes with combat sports is like, oh no, if you go out of bounds, then we're gonna reset in the middle, right? But when you're doing these more traditional martial arts, they are built for an environment, right? And you wanna utilize the constraints of that environment. And there's that, another one with that is like the classic argument about Japanese jiu-jitsu and armor, right? It's like, well, they were wearing armor, so we have to do it this way because you were wearing armor, right? And that would totally constrain the way you're fighting and moving. Maybe we need to change it because we don't wear armor anymore, but nevertheless, it might give us an understanding of why something was performed a certain way.
Like a lot of long bridge techniques and a lot of different weird stuff can be attributed to like armor. Like think about how the body responds and how different it is. So absolutely. And
there's also I've heard something that like Chen style Tai Chi was optimized for fighting on top of walls.
Oh,
That
wow.
the,
Awesome.
the emphasis on pushing people far away had to do with you're fighting on top of a wall, and if you just pushed them off the wall, they would fall and die.
There
Right?
you go. So that's a specific thing. And bringing it back to Wing Chun, now that we're on Kung Fu, I would have the funniest daydreams. And I just vividly remember that first daydream, and it was just like, I don't know, I was in a pub or whatever, and I had to go to the water closet, to the toilet. And then I just saw how tiny it is. And the first thing that popped to my mind, oh, if I had to fight somebody right now, I'd fuck him up with Wing Chun.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
If he was outside, then probably wouldn't fight and wouldn't be Wing Chun. But right here, oh man, that'd be a Wing Chun fight film. It'd be so cool
Yeah, it's like a scene out of Ip Man, right?
because it's so different. Like you can't throw a high kick, you can't shoot for a double leg, you can't do this. If I push you against the wall, they just elbows galore and just control knees, and
Yeah,
it's
you
all
can't grapple. Like it's just like
yeah, exactly. And it's just conditionally it becomes, oh yeah, so now this is Wing Chun.
yeah.
So yeah, also this great comment, Chisao for grip fighting. That is so true. That's so good for hand and eye coordination to like catch it and even breaking grip. Like if somebody catches you, do this like from karate, but you can do the same things with Chisao and stuff. So that's awesome. And now in fact that I think we have a lot of comments, so we can maybe go
Yeah,
through.
sure.
Yeah, if you find something, you can see. So let's see. Oh, so you have somebody that already followed you, which is awesome. I hope that a lot of people also follow the same channel because I've been subscribed to your channel for the longest time. So there are some jokes. Yeah, somebody said, from my experience, fitness and athletic ability beats technique, and that's the I see red thing that you said. Like,
Yeah. I mean, it also deals with action capacity, which is something that I think is important because, like, fundamentally in martial arts, we have striking, grappling, and then conditioning, right? So that pretty much encompasses all of the training methods we see in martial arts, and I think that a lot of traditional martial arts are heavy in their own archaic ways on developing the action capacity of the fighter. You know, various forms of body hardening, reflex training, kind of like the idea of like Chisao isn't grip fighting, but if I get my reflexes really sharp and my reaction time and very sensitive, right? Like that sensitivity is its own sort of action capacity, right? So if we develop these action capacities, that those often trump skill, right? And I think this is kind of a silly debate in some regards because, you know, if you have somebody who's highly skilled but with a moderate action capacity, they might beat somebody with a high action capacity that's not skilled, right? If you have somebody with no action capacity, they're probably dead, right?
yes.
So
Right.
you need both, right? Like you need both, and we want to look to increase both of them. Probably you want to spend if you're reasonably in shape, you probably want to spend more time focusing on skill development than on developing your action capacity, right? But if you're 400 pounds and can't walk up a flight of stairs, then maybe in that case. So I think it's a case to case basis of, you know, where are you lacking, and also what's your goal, and then developing the action capacity that you need along with the skill. You know, they go together. To me, those three elements are sort of inseparable. There's striking, there's grappling, and there's conditioning, and we want to have some level of ability in all three.
Exactly.
We don't want to leave anything out.
Because I have the best jab in the world. If I'm scared to throw it, I'm gonna lose. Like,
Yeah.
if I'm just not gonna do it, then what are you gonna do now? So
yeah, or if your arm is so brittle that you could throw that jab, but you're gonna break your arm, it doesn't do you any good.
exactly, and that's the whole no glove thing. That's why Bas Rutten used to slap the shit out of people.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Totally.
let's see. There's plenty of comments, so giving that a go. That's cool. Kicks from Seiza, Surabigato, or any Kamae, they're all unique. Exactly. Like every technique could have their own name if we wish to do that.
Yeah.
This spamming was an inside joke by our Martial Geeks member. That's a friend from the club and the channel, and that's essentially, I'd had to explain this to a previous guy, so I have to explain it to you, which ruined the joke. But hey, there you go. That's winged in Croatian. That's our language. And tuna, it sounds like chun, so like wing chun, but tuna is a slang for wiener. So that's a winged wiener, and that's very. So
Very
is
funny.
Chun discovered or created? So I have no clue. I hope that doesn't exist. So, right? What do we have? Street Fighters. Okay, jokes about bending against the purple belt. And oh yeah, so we had Alan. I'm not sure if he's still watching, but he left a comment, and I think you're the perfect person to like talk about all this stuff, because I still do Wing Chun forms, and I still see value in doing them, because like I haven't done any Tai Chi ever, or haven't really focused on stuff like that. But definitely my view and entry of like internal martial arts, like again, semantics, we can always debate what it actually is. But the way I see it, that's where Wing Chun forms come into play. That's internal arts. And he asked here, has you ever seen someone hop? That's also kind of like an inside joke that we have, because he's a Tai Chi person. He's fought 3 times in the semi-pro MMA, but he's a Tai Chi guy. And then I'm like a sort of mixture of like Kung Fu styles and this and that. And we're all like into that sort of internal martial arts.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of people like who think of it as like the Force from Star Wars. And it's super sad that you enter a position where you're defending these concepts from like MMA people or combat sports guys that think, oh, that's like chi bullshit, whatever. And then you say, no, it's internal martial arts principles about like the body mechanics, understanding breath, like feeling energy. It's about this philosophical stuff. But then you also have to defend it against those people who genuinely think that it's like force power, that it's like no touch techniques, like the Dillmans and Misners and people like that. So it's kind of shitty to be in this position, because you're like defending.
Yeah, I think it's very tricky. You know, I think that there's not enough people they have a tendency to get into these conversations on all sides, and that they haven't really done enough due diligence. So there's a couple of things here that I think are worth unpacking. I guess the best place to start is maybe with the idea of action capacity. So there's different ways of using the body, and I've been doing some research into strength training recently that really reveals this to be true. So there's different components to our muscles. Our muscles have a contractile component, and they also have an elastic component, and the way that the body is utilized is different amongst different people. So I think a lot of what's going on in some of these internal arts is that basically, in order to use when we're at rest, there's a certain amount of slack on the muscle, and that slack on the muscle means that there's going to be time where the muscle is contracting but not causing any movement. It also means that when you take a force, there's less tensegrity, and your ability to recoil that force is less. So I think a lot of what's going on in internal martial arts is training the nervous system to utilize tension. Actually, they often talk about it as relaxation, but there's a big gap between ancient ways of talking and thinking about these things and what exactly is going on in the body from an anatomy and physiology standpoint. So I think when you talk about something like Fa Jin, for example, what we're really talking about is using the elastic component of the muscle, so creating enough tension in the system that you can, in a generalized way, rebound force off of the ground or rebound force from an opponent in a unique trained fashion. And there's different ways that athletes will achieve this in traditional sports. Like there's something called a counter movement. So if you're going to go right, you will turn left a little bit first, and that allows you to move. If you've ever seen cats paw at the ground before they go to jump,
Yes.
that's an example of a counter movement, right? They're actually tensioning, they're pre-tensioning the muscles so that they can make a big leap.
Yes.
The disadvantage of counter movements is that it's very slow.
Mm-hmm.
So the another movement solution to this is something called a co-contraction. And a co-contraction is when you engage the opposite muscle group. So if you look at standing meditation or forms practice, a lot of what you're doing is you're practicing the tensioning of the whole system so that it
Yes.
can react and respond very fast. So it's interesting because scientifically we can say that there are absolutely different ways to utilize your musculature, and we can also say that there are ways that need to be trained, right? So these are not natural ways of moving, these are trained ways of moving. And a lot of these movement systems, right, are there to develop this type of action capacity. Where
Right.
that gets confusing is that you could have a system like push hands, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's there to develop that action capacity. And you have somebody who's only interested in the development of this action capacity. They're only interested in quote unquote what we would call like cultivation. They're not necessarily interested in fighting, right? And
Yes.
they're continuously developing that action capacity, maybe to a very high level. It doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily equate to fighting skill.
Exactly. Exactly.
So you might see some of these demonstrations, and it's not a demonstration of fighting skill. It's
Yes.
not about they can bounce you away if you were trying to hit them. They can bounce away somebody who's engaging in the drill in the game that they're engaging in, that they're
Perfect.
using to develop that action capacity. So it's not there for fighting, right? So even if you see somebody hopping, it's not always fake. It's
Yes.
just both people have tensioned their bodies in such a way, and it's made the person susceptible to a type of movement that doesn't look natural because it's not natural, but they're
Exactly.
both working on developing an action capacity, and it's there's some level of cooperation there.
Yes, and I love that this is that we're discussing this now, because my whole thing is it all lays in the claims, and that's a lot of people when they think about like things like propositional logic. It's about what claim are you making,
Yeah.
because a lot of people when I talk to them get confused because sometimes I see like a Wing Chun Chi Sao demo, like Francis Fong or somebody great like
Yeah.
literally uproot a person, and they go
Yeah.
like this. And then I say, "Oh, that's awesome Wing Chun." But then I see somebody like Adam Meisner or somebody like that make somebody hop, and they say, "Well, why do you poo-poo this?" And it's all in the claims. It's not
Yeah.
about like the thing that's happening. Like if you're open about this uprooting nature that just happened is like you said, it's a cooperative like sensitivity drill or whatever it might be in different circumstances, different martial arts, and it's like internal practices of like real like contractions of muscles where you're trying to really achieve, and it's not directly necessarily fighting, versus somebody who does the same or similar thing that does say that it's for fighting. So a lot of
Yeah.
people
Well,
confuse
it
that
can be
it's
used for fighting, right? Like it's an action capacity that's relative to fighting, but without coupling it with fighting training, it's not necessarily going to be useful in that regard, right? So you need to do the fighting training as well. Um, but it doesn't I don't think it's not fighting,
yeah,
but it also isn't fighting. It's kind of in a gray area.
nothing
Um,
is black and white. Nothing is black and white, especially not in martial arts.
yeah. I mean, another aspect to it that I feel like maybe I differ from the popular opinion on this is the whole chi and ki issue. Um, I think there's a number of ways to approach this. The first thing I'll say is I think if we're talking about action capacity, that it's absolutely a real action capacity, because there's an ability of your mind to interface with your nervous system and your musculature to be able to affect you to move in these specific trained ways. And I think that that capacity is a lot of times what they're talking about when they talk about chi. And there's a lot of unique sensations that will come up when you're training in this way, and it will feel like certain things. Like Chu Song Ting said that he was practicing this stuff, and he started to feel like something was coming out of his fingers. Like he was sure he could feel something coming out of his fingers, and he tried for months to move candle flames in a piece of paper, and it ultimately didn't work. And he said, you know what, it just feels like something's coming out. So it's just he captured the feeling. And I think that it's tricky because you get these sensations, and the sensations, right? Like we're doing standing meditation, it feels like you're relaxing, but ultimately you're tensioning, right? It doesn't, you don't want to tense. Mentally you need to actually tensioning. So there's a big difference between being the driver of the system and how you drive the system versus the mechanics of how it actually works. So I think that it becomes very tricky. And to take it even a step further, people talk about, no touch. Can you beat somebody without touching them? You absolutely can beat somebody without touching them. It's entirely possible. And if you look at Indian martial arts, Indian dance, you look at Japanese dance, you'll see that there is a very clear definition of prana, of ki, as being communicated through gesture, expression, and a felt sense of the opponent. So if you train in a certain manner, you can generate a felt sense that you're going to defeat the other person.
And that's
totally possible. So you use your body language, you use your gesture, and you show the person that they can't beat you. You use your positioning. And some of that comes down to having the ability to beat them if you do engage, but you can actually communicate without speaking or with speaking, right? It can be vocalized. That's what ki is, right? So it can be vocalized or non-vocalized, but you're still communicating. So there's an example of this in the fight between Anderson Silva and Israel Adesanya. If you watch the fight, the first couple rounds they were going at it, and then there comes a point in the fight where they both realize that they're both very dangerous and they could really hurt each other, and they start play fighting.
Exactly.
They didn't talk about it. They didn't say, you know what, let's stop going at it, let's start play fighting. The danger inherent in each person was unconsciously, through body language, through fighting, communicated to each other, and they decided, you know what, let's stop. You can see it also with Gordon Ryan. If you watch Gordon Ryan's grappling matches, he demonstrates such prowess and such ability that the opponents simply give up. They just concede. All right, so there's absolutely an ability to communicate without speaking, and I think that this is the essence of what this chi or ki actually is in martial arts. I mean, I was just reading a text from a Japanese sword school yesterday, and it was talking about interpreting the ki of the opponent. Are they scared? Are they going to advance? Are they brazen? Are they, overwhelmed? In interpreting their energy, interpreting their getting a felt sense, reading the opponent as a method and a part of fighting is actually very important. And then it becomes a question of, well, can this be cultivated? It can be cultivated, but again, it's an action capacity that aids you in fighting. It's not fighting. You have to do the fighting training in a coupled manner in order to weaponize that action capacity. There's another story from Chinese, from the Three Kingdoms period, and no idea how true this is or not, right? But it's a story where It's the Battle of Changban Bridge, and Zhang Fei is defending the bridge alone against the incoming Wei forces, and the people are charging the bridge, right? And he lets out a really loud scream because he's getting ready to fight, and he screams, and one of the enemy's generals, one of Cao Cao's generals, the horse gets spooked, and the guy falls off the horse and dies because you can get very injured falling off of a spooked horse. So what happened? Well, it's Kia. He yelled. It scared the horse, and it killed the general. I mean, that's a confirmed kill by somebody yelling.
You didn't touch him. And I think I have a perfect but funny example, because recently on YouTube there's been a lot of these like streamers and influencers getting like annihilated by pro fighters. Like I think some guy, I have no clue what his name was, but he sparred Sean O'Malley. Then the other guy sparred like Sean Strickland. And craziest thing about some of those, at least, and a lot of those that I've seen in a certain area, the actual final blow that beat them was a no-touch KO.
Yeah.
Because the last thing that you would see is like a fighter do this, and the other guy knows what's coming. It's crumble. Okay, I'm done.
And they just fall over. They don't want to fight anymore. Yeah.
That literally, he finished the fight without touching them. And like think about any other feint in martial arts, like that also no touch technique.
Yep.
Like I do this, you do this. Now maybe there's a head kick coming or something, but I made you move. I made you react. So it's not.
Yeah, there's some instances with Jordan Burroughs of him faking double legs so hard that the other person goes to sprawl and they fall and hit their head on the mat.
Perfect.
Like it's entirely possible to interact with the opponent before you make contact with them, and you could train those things and you would probably look really silly, right? Yeah. So I tend to reserve the judgment on some of this stuff just because I feel like there's lots of action capacities that are there to be trained and developed. And people might look very silly or outlandish doing it, but that's their area of interest, right? And it could become very effective at some point if they wanted to couple it with fighting.
Exactly, and that's the whole thing. Like to bring it back to the earlier point, like now we've actually explored the whole idea of chi or ki and like internal and like no touch and this all this type of stuff, and to me, what like matters to me in these types of conversations is really the propositional logic aspect of it, like just the claims you make. That's what differentiates how I'm going to respond, and I would talk and like engage with people on that side, and I would even try and go with like an mild approach and be thoughtful. Just say about like not being convinced of a claim isn't like I'm claiming that it's false. It's just I'm not convinced of this given the evidence, given the circumstances, or whatever. And it's always about the claim. So if you claim that you can, not by power of suggestion or whatever really might happen, but you're claiming something specifically different that's non-demonstrable, and or if it's done in a fashion that you can knock out any MMA fighter just by doing this, that's the problem arises. So it's not even against internal martial arts. It's not even against chi and any of this stuff. It's not even against no touch like we touched upon. It's just where the claim lies. And so a lot of people and admittedly, like people do see poo-poo this type of stuff because it's generally perceived as people who are like living in a fantasy land, but that shouldn't be the end of what you're trying to.
I think there is a seductive fantasy there that by developing some of these action capacities in a sort of unlimited manner that you would then be able to be effective fighting. And I think that's kind of misguided, right? Like we need to do the fighting training in order to weaponize those action capacities.
Exactly. Because like I would like I made a video where I essentially explained why I'm not convinced in claims that like Adam Meisner made. And I was really trying to be nice about like why I'm not convinced, not saying this is fake, this is false, this is bullshit, just why I'm not convinced of the specific claim that's being made. And then a lot of people would misconstrue that and think I'm attacking internal martial arts. And then they'd be surprised when I say, well, I do internal martial arts. I do film Dao.
Which claims were you specifically going against?
The specific claims of defending an MMA style takedown, like a double leg, and so that one and the couch fighting, where it's a lot of these like specific skills absolutely can work, and they're actually pretty useful for fighting. Like I do Chisao, I do forms, I understand the relationships and all this stuff, but it's like if you claim that from just harnessing a specific skill, you can just make people just fall over in this fashion, instead of saying, well, this is like you said, a specific skill that translates to a specific thing. I have no problem with that. It's just where the claim lies. And so then people would be all like, okay, so you're not against internal stuff, so you're not against. No, it's just where the claim lies. That'd be like, I can do a double leg. I do double legs all the time. But if I claim I can double leg Stipe Miocic and beat him, it's that would be a claim that's not fair on my side, because he's much than me. But it's not the problem of double leg. It's the problem of
it's a good point. Like I could defend a double leg from an MMA fighter using Tai Chi, who's not particularly good. But if you get Khabib out there and have him try to double leg me, he's gonna double leg me. It's a matter of the relative skill of the parties involved. Yeah, I mean, and again, that comes back to, are we fighting a technique versus a technique? Are we, because that it makes a big difference when you're looking at that type of thing. It's not a technique versus a technique. It's a martial artist versus another martial artist. So we can't say that this particular move is going to work for everybody in all situations.
Exactly. And it's never the problem inherently about the technique or the practice or the conceptual thing that you're saying. It's never inherently that. It's the situational thing. Like you said, like it's going to be different. So and there's various levels of that, of course, in terms of like applicability and this and that. Like somebody might put the Koregaeshi in sort of that area where, well, try and do Koregaeshi against the BJJ black belt. Well, chances are I'm not going to be able to do any basic techniques the black belt. Give me a blue belt on my level, then Koregaeshi is going to happen. So it's the
absolutely
same.
Yeah, because it's all of those factors combined. We're looking at the action capacity of the person, their skill, their experience, what's going on in the environment, how did they sleep. There's so many, factors combined that are going to make for that.
Yeah.
Well, it was really great. It was really great to do this. I really enjoyed talking to you. I have to teach a class, so I'm going to have to head out. But
whoa, we almost did 2 hours. Well, that's plenty of like talking, yapping about martial arts. I love this. Of this was super
it was fun. Excellent. It was very enjoyable. Maybe do it again sometimes.
Absolutely, whenever. And of course, like this will be posted later on. I'll keep it on the channel. So if you want to clip it or use any clips or whatever, absolutely go for it. I'll probably clip some interesting parts of the conversation, maybe edit them into videos. I often do that. So if you want to do that, of course, it is completely shared. So
excellent, man. Thank you so much.
Thank you for doing this, and guys in the comments, thank you for engaging and listening to this stuff. So that was live. Jamie, one more time, thank you, and I should probably be going. Of course. Ciao.
Bye-bye.
Take care, my man.